All right, what's up, everybody? This is Ryan here, back for another Q&A. A couple minutes late today, but it has been a busy morning, and I see there's only 2 viewers at the moment, so I don't think it's a big deal. So let's get started. All right, so I guess just one announcement. I'm going to be doing some live coding / Q&A on Twitch. For sure Mondays, possibly some other days, but for now I'm just going to stick to Monday. I was doing live lessons on Twitch, but I found that I don't really have an environment which is conducive to teaching lessons live off the top of my head. And also, it was kind of a pain in the ass doing lesson plans on Sunday evening because I work pretty hard at my job and I kind of like having my weekends to do weekend things. But, anyways, that's perfectly okay. But yeah, I'll continue to do the YouTube Q&As on Wednesdays, and yeah, we'll just kind of keep experimenting with Twitch streaming. I also finally thought of a project which I wanted to build, which was a day planner application, which I actually already have built before. I'm not sure if I have any examples online here of it, but it's basically a day planner in the sense that it's like a way to loosely schedule your day in either 15-minute, 30-minute, or 45-minute or hour-long intervals. So I find it very useful. Sorry, my cats have the zoomies if you see me looking around. Just waiting to see if they're going to attack my ankles. But yeah, I find it very useful. So I don't schedule my day as in like writing in everything in like a notepad, but I find it very useful to have a good general idea of what I'm doing throughout most of the day, including scheduling in time off. So, hey, what's up, Ashish? I'm doing pretty well. Pretty tired today. I was up at 5 a.m. and I didn't manage to get to sleep until probably about 10:30 p.m. last night. So yeah, little bit tired, but I've got a large cup full of coffee, so we'll make it happen. Butteress, what's your Twitch handler? I posted the link in there. Ryan_Michael_K. I just hit 50. Well, it depends on where you look, but in the let's see here, the creator dashboard, I have exactly 50 followers, so that's nice. And that didn't take quite as long to get to as I thought. Hey, what's up, Ansh? Yep, I'm live again. I'm struggling to do these live streams, to be honest, because I'm still working full time, but I'm just trying to make it happen. On which project will you do live streams? What things will I cover? So at the moment, on Twitch, I'll be live streaming kind of not so much a rebuild, but like an upgrade of a day planner application, which I plan to actually personally use, and that'll happen on Twitch. For sure Mondays. Sorry, 1 second. Hey, guys, cut it out. Sorry, I've got one cat that likes to beat up the other cat. So yeah, that'll happen on Mondays. This is why I was doing lessons on Mondays, live lessons, and I can't do it because like these cats just drive me insane here. Anyways, what's up, Hamet? So yeah, I'll be the live coding will take place on Twitch for sure. I'm not going to do live coding on YouTube. And for sure Mondays at the same time roughly as I'm doing this Q&A now. And I may add more days, I may not, because I just really don't have a lot of spare time, to be honest. And even less spare energy. But trying to keep some kind of content going because I really enjoy doing live stuff. It's one of the few things in my life that work-wise takes no effort and is very enjoyable. And as the late Alan Watts once said, this one's worth writing down, find some way to get paid to play. And for me, that's pretty much doing live content. So yeah, anyways, I see we have some people who aren't new but used to watch the live streams and are back now. So the format's pretty well the same. Ask away. I'm trying to avoid doing too much like hyper specific implementation questions, but you know, if we don't get any other questions, I probably will try. Hakeem asks, how am I doing? I'm pretty good. I'm tired, and this is my third week doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and last night's practice was really tough. The last person I grappled with was a 240-pound rugby player. I know he was a rugby player because I asked him, "Hey, do you play rugby?" Yeah, I thought so. So yeah, that's I weigh just under 200 pounds. I'm not sure exactly what that is. It's like 80, I think it's like 90 kilos, something like that. So yeah, I'm sore today and tired, but we're making it happen. Hakeem liked my Alan Watts mention. Yeah, Alan Watts. I've listened to a lot of his stuff, and yeah, pretty impressive. Oh wow. Um, wow, we're starting with easy questions today. What are your thoughts on structuring a payment system? Um, so just right up front, I've never structured a payment system. So my usefulness in this question will be very limited. Um, so what can I say about it? I mean, so this would be one of those cases. This is an interesting case. So my opinion on studying design patterns extensively and applying them religiously has changed over the years. I think the time I spent studying design patterns was useful. I can't remember any of the names. The ones that I do use in my code, I generally use. I generally don't know what the name of it is. And when it comes to like a lot of Android development, I really don't think of my code in terms of design patterns very frequently, because there were design patterns that a younger Ryan thought, "Oh, I'll use this everywhere, and it solves all these problems," and then an older Ryan is like, "Well, that didn't actually really solve more problems than it uh, created." But when it comes to structuring a payment system, this would be somewhere where I I would become very familiar with locks and transactions across clients and servers. So what you'd my very limited understanding of this is like when you're dealing with people's money, you need a lot of infrastructure in the code to sort of establish like 100% sure that the money goes from this account to that account. And if some part of that process fails, that the money goes back into the original account if it happened to be held in some middle place for a little while. So this would be a case where on structuring a payment system, I don't know what structures you would use, but I would study that extensively. Let me see. I might not have my book handy. Do I have? Um, yeah, I don't think I have it handy, but I would suggest looking into Martin Fowler's work. Maybe so. The book I have, I just don't seem to have it handy. Is no, I guess I don't. Patterns, patterns of enterprise architecture, something like that. But I yeah, I would look to someone like Martin Fowler and see if they have specific patterns that you can learn to do with structuring a payment system, because this would be a situation where like I wouldn't want to just be like YOLOing it and inventing my own stuff. I would want to be well researched in the existing patterns and structure, because when you're dealing with people's money, you can't screw around, because if you do, you're going to get in big trouble. So, not a very useful and in detail. Oh, they use Stripe. Oh, well, I did actually use Stripe in an application. You said structuring a payment system, not using an API for that. Huh. Well, I wish I'd read that comment soon. I did use Stripe once in an application. All right, we'll just read their docs then. I don't know. Anyways, yeah. But I think I've answered like what I would do if I had to actually structure my own payment system. I imagine with Stripe, then you'll probably just have to read their documentation and follow it closely. Uh, Buttery, which I don't know. The last thing I'll say regarding your question is just be very familiar with local and international rules regarding payments. Oh, I get you. So they want to go in house. Yeah. Well, everything I said pretty much. But just make sure you're familiar with rules and regulations. I'm not sure if the country where you're from, they have super strict rules, but to give you an example, in Canada we have like federal rules about user data collection and stuff like that, and then we have like really strict provincial rules um, about also data, but also like taxes. Like different provinces in Canada will have different tax rates and stuff like that. So I hope you don't have to deal with all that stuff, because yeah, it's pretty crazy. Anyways, hopefully some of that was useful. Ashish asks, will I cover testing as well? I can't remember. I feel like I did a lesson on testing, but it got pretty strongly derailed, so I might not have even bothered to add it to my channel. Let me just check really quickly. Yeah, I don't think I did bother. I'll certainly cover testing in the future, but maybe not in the immediate future. Okay. Let's see here. Hakeem. So Hakeem asks, I genuinely don't know whether to use a framework or just vanilla JS with CSS and HTML. What do you recommend? This is without a doubt one of those situations where you have to kind of work out your own priorities and values and goals. Like, what are you looking to get out of your studies slash web development, your study of web development? Because the thing about this is you it's about trade-offs is what I'm trying to say. It's never really a you should do this or do that. So I can speak to some experience as a an Android developer. I won't use Android development specific examples, but when I started Android development, I had this attitude that what made a good developer was being on top of the latest tools and libraries and being familiar with them. And further, uh, yeah, I guess that was the main thing, using them in your projects. And the more libraries I used, the more magic I used essentially, the less time I would have to spend implementing those things myself. And that can be a good thing. What that allowed me to do is it allowed me to get good at building things sort of quickly. Now, the problem with that approach, where I leaned on frameworks, is that I had no effing idea what they were doing, or very little idea. And like years later, like 4 or 5 years later in my career, I started to really heavily study those things because I realized that the one thing that people had over me, so I'm a self-taught developer, the one thing that people from universities tended to have over me, depends on the university or college they went to, was an understanding of how things worked under the hood. So it's basically what I'm saying here is it's a trade-off. Long term, as a developer, I think you want to study, you want to know what you're doing with vanilla JS and CSS and HTML. Long term. If you plan on being, a web developer for a long time and you want to eventually be like a senior developer and like really be good, but that might not be the best thing short term. What I might suggest, here's what I would suggest to you without knowing more about your situation. Build something fairly simple in pure, JS, CSS, HTML. Like, don't go crazy, but build something relatively simple. If you haven't already, at first. And then once you've done that, once you're familiar with like how the DOM works and so on and so forth, I'm not an expert web developer. I only have a basic understanding of web dev. But once you understand some core concepts like how the DOM, the document object model works, how JS is executed in the browser, stuff like that. Then if your goal is to like get a job, then yeah, you'll probably want to learn whatever is the latest framework. I'm not going to tell you which framework to learn because, like I say, I'm not a web developer. I would highly suggest coding in Flow. I'm sure some of you know who this German is, but he's doing a lot of web content now. And if you want to learn more about it, I would suggest Florian's channel. He's a very good teacher. So that's I think that's all I care to say about this one. All the useful things I can say. So just to summarize, it's a trade-off. You'll get people who will say you should do you should write everything in assembly language, and like no, that's bullshit. But it's cool to know how to write assembly. And then the other end of that spectrum is the developer that I used to be, who every time I had a problem to solve, I wanted to look for a library to solve it for me. And then like 3 years later, I'm like, I have no idea what any of these tools are doing under the hood. And once I started, like I actually, let me see if I can find this. GitHub. In the past like 3 years, I started to do what I call third-party library minimalism. Like I'll just give one example here. I built a weather app, and like the level of minimalism I used here is I did use Compose for the what do you call it? Oh, do I have my? I don't think I have my API key. Good, I put it in build config. But I actually like I wrote my own like HTTP URL connection code, which isn't that complicated. I'm not trying to be like, ooh, but what I'm trying to say is I didn't use OKHTTP and retrofit. And that's so I understood better, like how do these things work. So one example. I see we have a bunch of questions and comments at this point. What's up, Harish and everybody else who said hi? Let me go through these a little bit quicker. Okay, so where were we? Hakeem, Hopefully that was useful. We've got Abdo. Hopefully that was what you wanted me to call you. I think it was, or maybe it was somebody else. I had a question with engineering manager interview, and I've been asked a question about using use case in an MVVM architecture. And there's a follow-up here. Okay, so multi-part question, which is okay. Oh, and there's more here. I've answered that if there's no logic, we shouldn't add the extra layer. Okay, so to summarize the question, I had a question with an engineering manager in an interview and asked about using use cases in MVVM architecture. And I answered that I'm using a use case if there is logic I should do for the feature, and he didn't seem okay with the answer. I would like to ask, is it mandatory to use use cases? I've answered that if there is no logic, we shouldn't add extra layer. Could you explain your opinion? I'm tempted to go different ways with this question, but what I would say right off the bat is if the use case becomes an extra arbitrary layer, which I think is what you were getting at in this, if the use case becomes an extra arbitrary layer, then there is no point, or sorry, let me be careful with my language. Then it does not solve any useful problems, is what I would say. It's really just extra work. I'll go into the counter arguments to that, but I want to actually pull up an example here. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to go into the domain. So this is, I think, circa like 2018 or something like that, when I was super into clean architecture. And what you'll see is, so there's certain cases where you'll see a use case and it's coordinating multiple like backend services, multiple repositories. Let's just say backend services, whatever. Backend things. There's like a remote registry, a transaction registry. There's a lot of stuff going on here. This is a situation where I'm happy to have a use case here. It I think Uncle Bob would say it coordinates the dance, so to speak, of the entities, I think is what he said. But this is a situation where, okay, there's some logic here. If, you know, the local data the local data source fails, sorry, if the remote data source fails, we fall back to the local one. In this case, this app is capable of storing offline transactions and pushing them to the remote when an internet connection is established again. So now we're complicated. We have some business logic, which has to do with, and I hate that term business logic because it's kind of annoying to define, but hopefully you understand what I mean. But yeah, this would be a case where, cool, use case makes a lot of sense. Let me show you another use case or interactor in the same project. Let's go to anonymous node source. This is where, okay, now it's pointless. What you see here, I wish it would stop doing that. What does that happen when I just click on that? Interesting. That seems like a new feature. What we have here is you've got a use case, which is an extra arbitrary layer to delegate or to call to a repository function. And this is where use cases are totally pointless. So if the use case becomes an extra arbitrary layer, it doesn't solve any problems. It's just an arbitrary extra layer. If in certain cases, if in certain cases some of the business logic is complex, you might add a use case for that situation. Otherwise, just call the backend service or repository or whatever you want to call it. People don't define these things the same way, so I'm just, this is a vague definition here. But what I am not for is I'm not for extra arbitrary layers of code. I used to be when I thought it was the cool thing to do, and then a couple people and myself really thought about this and said, well, what is this actually helping with here? And here's the thing, like, I'm not one of those people who, like, is all about writing the minimal lines of code ever to solve a problem. My code is quite verbose and easy to read, but being like concise is not always my highest priority. I'd rather something works well and is very legible over something that's just really short, basically. But yeah, this is my opinion on this topic. It would be interesting to know the engineering manager's rationale. The only sort of counterpoint I can think of that someone would bring up, and there could totally be more, is you could make the argument down the road later on, as we build the application, we will want this use case layer. My rebuttal to that would be that's called premature optimization. Without knowing more context, I don't agree with the engineering manager, but I don't really have enough information. But I think what I said here is pretty well what you were getting at. That if there's no logic, we don't need it. If it's literally just like an extra layer that calls some single backend service and doesn't care if it's a success or a failure, then yeah, it's pointless. He told me that I removed a complete layer in architecture and it will not be consistent. Yeah, let me paste this in here. And I realize this is going to be me like arguing with an engineering manager, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and some engineering managers are there because they were around for a long time and not because they're great. I don't know about this person in particular. He seemed not okay with my answer, and he told me that I removed a complete layer and the architecture will not be consistent. My question would be, was this person talking about a specific project with specific requirements, or were they implying that every single project should have the same architecture? Because if that's what this person was getting at, that every project should have the same architecture, then I can say quite confidently that they don't know what they're talking about. And what they are doing is they are taking one model and trying to apply it to every situation, which is a sign of someone who is rigid in their thinking, to put it very politely. And you will find people like this who don't really understand software architecture in the context of applying a lot of different architectures and a lot of different projects and seeing that the project will tell you what the architecture would look like. And in me saying the project will tell you what the architecture would look like, what I mean specifically is, here's an example. If there's no logic in that use case layer, that's the project telling you you don't need to have that extra layer. Here's really what it comes down to. Any architecture tool/principle should be applied only to the extent that it solves more problems than it creates. Now, it might not solve, or it might not create any problems, arguably, but if it's not solving a problem, then that still fails my test. I'm glad I was able to clear things up possibly for you, Abdo. And you'll get that. People have their opinions, and that's okay. I have my opinions. Okay, let's see here. Who next? Kevin Mitnick, I think they were referring to Hakeem's question about I think web libraries. But in case you were asking me, Kevin, no, I have not personally tried Svelte. All right, question from Parth. Aaron, where can I find Monday lessons you're talking about? The best place to do that would so I am most active on Twitter. At wise ass 301, Twitter or X, and I realize some people aren't on there. It's the platform that works well for me because it's very low effort. But I will post about my live streams generally ahead of time on Twitter. You can also follow me on Twitch, and let me see if I can get the schedule link. I should have a link here which has like my schedule. Creator. This could take a moment here. Community, no, content. I'm still very much learning the UI for Twitch. Here we go. This is what I was looking for. You could just do, this gives you my Twitch schedule, and I do try to keep this up to date. I'll also paste it in the comments. All right. Okay, so moving on. Ibrahim says apps are solutions to specific problems. Frameworks are generic solutions that allow. I'll paste this in because this is a comment, or sorry, comments, and this is to do with our discussion earlier on should you learn frameworks or just vanilla or native or whatever. So Ibrahim says apps are solutions to specific problems. Frameworks are generic solutions that allow you to do an MVP project, and if necessary, customize the code a few releases later. I think this is general advice. I agree generally. There's specific cases where I don't agree, but I think this is a good general point you can make. Frameworks, they can help you solve problems quicker in some cases, not always, but in many cases, they can help you get running quickly. And that is certainly a reason to use frameworks. Where they will start to cause problems for you is whenever your requirements deviate from the capabilities of that framework, or if you have to install some gigantic framework when you only need like a little bit of the code from it, those are like a couple examples where you should definitely go for consider rolling your own solution. This is a fun, more subjective question. Kunal asks, is it true that the market is bloated with software engineers and hence getting fired? There's a number of things. So the economy kind of sucks right now, which means capital, i.e. investments, and investors, but capital is more limited. I think I can say that. Do I have the statistics in front of me that confirm what I just said here? No, I don't. This is just my general feeling. And then as a result, so many people have been laid off. As we all know, and this is objectively true, Google, Meta, other big companies, probably Amazon too, have had to do some major layoffs. So the talent pool is more saturated, and there are fewer options available. I think this is true. Now, when you ask me this question, Kunal, are you asking me this to make yourself feel comfortable in not applying to jobs? And you might not be asking it for that reason. I just wanted to check because I happened to get 2 Android jobs in the past 2 years during possibly the worst time ever to be hired as an Android developer, apart from maybe like the first year or something like that. And I was able to do that by applying to a ton of different places and working really, really hard. So, do I think this is probably, you can phrase it like this, that's fair. Do I think this is probably true? Yeah. Do I think this is an excuse to not work hard and send out like literally dozens of job applications? Well, if you want to get a job, you're going to have to work at it. And there are lots of jobs out there still. Like, don't look at this as I'm never going to get hired. Look at this as getting hired will be probably more difficult than it was 3 years ago, but it wasn't exactly easy 3 years ago. That's how I would approach it. All right, next question. Hello, Harish. Yassine says, hi from Morocco. I believe Arabic is spoken in Morocco, so marhaban. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I apologize. USA. USA. Every time I see your name, I just want to chant US. I'm Canadian though, so. As Android devs, should we learn database like MySQL, basics networking courses, and Docker, or just we have enough with Android courses framework? Yeah. So this answer might piss some people off. I do not see any reason at all to prioritize learning these things as an Android developer. Unless you want to work in maybe a small startup where they want you to also be like a, what do they call that? Platform engineer and backend developer. Just straight up, get really familiar with Android, the operating system, the SDK, and build Android apps, and just get really good with the client side of things. And I could go into more detail on this, but I've never been expected as an Android developer, and I have actually had some professional Android developer jobs at this stage in my career, to actually no, I did have to set up Docker in my current thing so that I could send test notifications. So there's some situations where this might be useful, but what I'm trying to say here is if you go into an interview about Android development and the company is as like, so let's say you go into like a junior or intermediate level Android interview, and the company doesn't hire you because you're not familiar with Docker and you can't write your own SQL statements, that's not a company you want to work for, probably. Unless they put that in the job description and they're literally like, you need to know these things because we expect all of our Android developers to know this. Barring that special situation, I've never been asked about Docker in an interview. Here are some of the things I might get asked. What databases do you prefer? Database or database drivers do you prefer? And I might answer, lately I've been using, what's it called? Come on, brain. I've only used this in personal projects. SQLite. Is that it? SQLite. Yes, sorry. It took me a minute to remember. We don't use this in production at work, so it took me a minute. Lately I've been using SQLite, but I am also familiar with Room, and it works fine. So that might be the kind of answer that I would give. Something like that. But Yeah, that's really like, to answer your question, no. Let me just give you one final point. Learn things, learn things based on building projects. Our I don't know what your education was like. My education in Canada, and I know this is true pretty well across the world, we get taught to learn things subject by subject, and rarely do we get taught build something and learn what you need to build that project. And if you want to learn something else, build a project which uses the things you want to learn. Let the projects guide your learning process. I never suggest, for example, like taking a networking course, um, because maybe that might be useful. If you're interested in networking, by all means, take a networking course. If you're not interested in it and it's just something you think you might need to do to get hired, that's a terrible reason to learn something. And if you can motivate yourself that way, good on you. I personally can't motivate myself that way. I get excited about building things and improving things. And through that process, I learn things and I get better and better. And that's what took me to where I am. Not like learning random topics. I started out trying to do that and I figured out really quickly it doesn't work for me. All right. Mo asks, I want to create a simple library for Android. What should I learn and start from? It depends on what kind of library you want to create a bit. But let me give you an example of a tiny library, which is could be an example. Here I have Googled combined tuple, and this is a library by my friend Zwinden. And we can look in here and we see the source is just a single file, which contains a bunch of these combined tuple functions. And I'm not really going to explain deeply what this does, but essentially how I would describe this is something that I'm quite sure my friend Zwinden here needed to solve a problem in his own projects, that being combining a large number of different asynchronous data sources. And so he wrote some code to do that, and then he decided, I assume, why don't I throw this up on GitHub and make it into a library? So in terms of like, getting started, pick something simple, and write the code, like build it. And then the next thing, which will be possibly trickier, and this might be the tricky thing, is how do you host that library? And this is not something I can explain to you because I've never hosted a library myself. But the first step I would look at is build something really simple. Maybe it's something that you wrote yourself and you use it in most of the projects that you create. But in this case, but the next step would be, how do I actually host this so that I can, if you're an Android developer, which I think that was the question. Yes. Figure out how to host it on Maven or whatever. Like I say, I've never actually done that myself, so I can't walk you through those steps, but you have to like host your code on Maven or something like that. And yeah, hopefully that answers your question. That's what I suggest. Yassine asks, do you know any best resources to learn testing? Because I see it in multiple times in job requirements. Testing is really tricky. Let me pull something up here. The first thing I'm going to suggest to you, Yassine, is I wrote an article which will hopefully explain why testing is annoying and difficult to learn. I was paid to write this for Twilio. Not going to comment further on that, but definitely not writing another article for them. But yeah, there's no paid. It's not behind a paywall, and yeah. So I suggest you read this article. Now, the code is in Java, but don't worry if you're a Kotlin developer. Don't worry about it. It's not important as long as you can read what is going on. And as you'll see here, I explain just about every line of code. I suggest you read this, and what it's going to do to you is it's going to explain sort of the very fundamentals or some fundamentals of testing. And then it's going to explain why some things are difficult to test and some things are easier to test. And it's going to give some suggestions for like a learning path. And I go into like, why is it really easy to write tests for code which doesn't have any third-party library dependencies? And then I talk about how when all of a sudden you're dealing in a GUI application like an Android app or something like that, all of a sudden it actually gets quite a bit, it can get very difficult to test things. And that's because all of a sudden you have to deal with third-party libraries and dealing with those dependencies. So I suggest that article. And then in terms of resources, search my channel on testing. I have a lot of content on testing, preferably some of the newer content, but search my channel. I've got lots of things. And then the most important thing is build a project using TDD, test-driven development. And it's important when you do this to keep a couple things in mind. You may not want to apply TDD in the view layer. So that would be like, you might want to skip espresso / roboelectric. However that's spelled, I don't really care, to be honest. You may not want to do this. Some companies, and I agree with this point, would argue that you should pull the critical logic of the application into classes that are easy to test, and you should test those classes. But when it comes to the view layer, you can write tests for it, but generally you're not actually testing the view layer. You're testing a bunch of like mocks or fakes or whatever term you want to use, test doubles. And then it's kind of like, what are you really testing here? Some companies are like, are super into automated UI tests. And if you're super into that and you know how to do that, I think that's great. I am not making fun of that or saying that's a bad idea. People have, this is something important to mention here. People have strong and different opinions about testing. What I would suggest for you in job requirements, like understand how to write unit tests at the very least, and how to test the critical logic of your application. And that article will pretty much explain that for you. And then as far as like going beyond that, it's going to depend on the company. Like I think at Meta, they use like some screenshot testing library. I don't work at Meta. Some companies probably use Espresso. To be honest, I've never worked in a company that actually really leaned into UI tests like that, automated UI tests, but it probably exists. I personally like to pull logic into classes that are easy to test and to test those classes with unit tests. And then I like to do integration. I should probably write this down. I like to pull app/presentation logic into classes that are easy to test, which means they don't have annoying dependencies, or they have fewer annoying dependencies, and test them extensively. And I actually forgot the other point I was going to make here. Sorry. That's what happens when you wake up at 5 a.m. But yeah, this is what I suggest for you. There was definitely another point I was going to make, and it just disappeared. But yeah, I've done a lot of Android interviews. At the very least, if you can tell your interview that you've done some kind of testing and you know how to write a unit test, for example, that's probably going to be sufficient. If you're a 10 out of 10 in every other place, but you don't know how to use espresso, which would be, well, I'm not a 10 out of 10 in every place, but I don't know how to use espresso. Is that going to be the reason you don't get hired? That's a really stupid reason to not hire someone. So that's my opinion. Yes, it was integration testing. Thank you, Cybershark. Yes. So I like to do integration tests with sort of real web servers using fake data. So this could be like for example, a staging server. So this would be a copy, not the production server, but like a staging server or a fake. Hopefully it uses like maybe some real data, not important sensitive user data, but a real server. I'm not a fan of like, for example, having like fake databases that you configure to return whatever the hell you want. You're not, or a fake like, listen, I've used mock web server before. I've used mock web server, and that could be useful in certain situations, but if at all possible for integration tests, I really prefer, for example, hopefully your company has like a staging server and you can test it doing that. I just realized I only have 4 minutes left. Let me go through these questions really quickly and then I'll have to sign off. So Dia Yan asks, what advice do you have for someone who has lost their drive to code daily? I constantly procrastinate learning on new things on my own and don't end up coding. I'm a mid-iOS and Android developer. There's so many questions I want to ask you because my answer would really change depending on the answer to these questions. But what I will say to you is, if you don't enjoy coding genuinely, and I'm not dissing you here, consider quitting and doing something different. But that's probably not the answer you're looking for. So the answer I would give you is, and this is what works for me in terms of like having the drive to do something daily. Basic habit acquisition. Begin with whatever amount of coding you can do on a bad day. So what does that mean? I'm going to ask you, how much coding could you do almost every day? I used to say every day, but you know, life sometimes is harsh. Begin with whatever amount of coding you can do on a bad day. And that could be an hour or 30 minutes. Now, this is the trick here. Some of us, in periods of our life, we're learning to code 6, 8, or 10, or 12 hours a day. So the idea of starting with 1 hour or 30 minutes sounds ridiculous. You have to ignore that logic in your brain. And you have to just start with whatever is the amount you can actually do on a bad day. And then start doing that every day you can. Try to do it every day. If, you know, a family member gets hurt or you get terminally ill, obviously you're not going to be worrying about your half hour of coding. But barring extreme instances, even when you're having a bad day, do whatever is the minimum amount. Develop that habit over, I would say, at least 2 weeks. Cool. And so once you're able to do 1 hour or 30 minutes, whatever it is, after at least a week, begin to gradually increment the amount. I would suggest adding 1 hour per week until you hit your goal. Personally, and I've talked to a number of people about this who are like very experienced developers, after about 4 hours, things start to go downhill. 4 hours of coding today is, in my experience and in the experience of some other people, generally like the golden time in terms of practice. And I'm not saying you should only code for 4 hours a day, don't get me wrong, but that's going to be the most productive. What I would typically do, so while I was unemployed and studying code, I would aim for 4 hours of coding and 2 to 3 hours of study every day. And I didn't take weekends. And this is about what I worked up to, but I started with this small amount. And so the final thing I'll say is make following the schedule the goal instead of looking at results. So in other words, the simpler way to put this is prioritize effort over results. Your goal every day is to hit your target. And if you do your 1 hour, then you give yourself positive feedback. You don't say to yourself internally, I should be doing more. You say to yourself, I did it. I hit my goal. If I don't get anything else done today, that's all right. And this is so important because if you don't start to give yourself positive reinforcement for hitting small, tangible goals, then you're probably going to fail. So I would like to spend a lot more time talking about this, but I got to start work pretty quick. But hopefully some of that was useful for you, Diane. That's what I suggest for you. Let me leave you with some advice from someone who's not a programmer. The best diet is the one you will follow. The best workout is the one you will do. And this is what we're talking about here. The best amount of daily coding is the amount you can do with your level of motivation in the moment. And this, by prioritizing the effort instead of by prioritizing getting on the bike instead of how far you traveled in a day, that is how you can become a lot more consistent. That is the biggest shift in my life in terms of productivity and just not getting depressed and totally unmotivated. When I started prioritizing effort over results, I got a lot better results. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Hopefully that was useful. I've got to start work in a little while. And I will see some of you on Monday on Twitch, where I do Q&A and live coding. Not many people show up at the moment, so it's usually more live coding. But you can drop by on Twitch and ask me questions, just like today. So that'll be Monday at, about an hour ago is when I would start in terms of like the time of day. And then I'll also be back on next Wednesday on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Bye, everyone.